All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are Locked On Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we're talking about the Falcons mining the CFL for talent and what that means, as well as answering several listener questions, including one on whether or not the Falcons making the playoffs in 2022 will determine the future of Arthur Smith.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com. RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, putting up weekly content at the Falcoholic, the SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And before we get into today's Q&A episode, I want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And I'll thank some of the people that make Locked On Falcons your second or third listen each and every day, because you know that Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify, as well as free and available now on YouTube. Check us out on YouTube by subscribing to Locked On Falcons. And when you do, make sure you give us that like. So today's episode, we are continuing what we talked about on yesterday's episode, answering some listener questions that I did not have the chance to answer on yesterday's episode. And today's episode, including sort of the first topic, we'll be talking about the Falcons seemingly mining the CFL for talent in recent days, bringing in several players from north of the border to play for the Falcons, as well as some other players, and working out some other players. We'll also be answering a ton of listener questions. The big one that we'll answer at the end of today's episode is whether or not the Falcons need to make the playoffs in year two in order to prove that Arthur Smith was a worthwhile hire. There's some data that suggests that basically if you don't make the playoffs within the first 2 years, that you're not going to wind up, at least having a chance at winning a Super Bowl, further down the road. So we'll look at that data and sort of parse what that means. But the other questions that we'll get into, we'll be answering a question about Calvin Ridley's contract status. Obviously, there's still some confusion surrounding that. We'll answer a question about whether or not the Falcons should be interested in drafting a center like Tyler Linderbaum out of Iowa in round one. We'll talk about whether or not the Falcons should do some compensatory picks. We'll talk about where the Falcons 2019 draft class ranks among sort of the last decade of drafts, and sort of my thoughts on that draft class now that we have 3 years to look back at that group, as well as whether or not the Falcons should be treating Russell Gage as a priority re-signing as he heads towards free agency. But before we get into all of that, guys, let's jump into the sort of CFL situation. And for those of you that need updates, the Falcons have added 3 players within the last couple of days, as they've signed several of their practice squad players to futures contracts. 15 out of the 16 players on the practice squad, everybody except for Matt Barkley, was re-signed. We'll see if maybe they bring back Matt Barkley at a later date. But in addition to those 15 players on the practice squad that were signed to futures contract, the Falcons added 3 more, one of whom was not a CFL player. That is cornerback Corey Ballantyne. His claim to fame, if you guys probably know him, he's a 6th-round draft pick of the Giants in 2019. And the weekend he was drafted, he was actually shot at a campus party at wherever, Washburn University in Kansas. And that kind of derailed his rookie season. But he seems like a guy that could potentially be penciled into a similar role as Kendall Sheffield, as a primarily special teams guy that's a back-end depth guy. That's kind of what he's been in the last couple of years as he's bounced around the NFL. And we'll see if, he has a better shot at sticking here in Atlanta moving forward. The Falcons signed another cornerback in D. Alford. He comes from the Canadian Football League. He had 4 picks this past year with, I think, Winnipeg. He was originally a undrafted free agent out of 2020 out of Tusculum, and never got picked up by an NFL team, went north of the border, and seemingly has been able to turn that into success and get a real shot at the NFL here in Atlanta. Obviously with those interceptions, show some ball skills, not necessarily the biggest guy, but certainly could be in the mix there for the Falcons, there for a depth role as well as Ballantyne. They also signed another player from the CFL, and Braden Linnaeus, a big wide receiver / tight end. I think he's listed at like 6'5", 230. The Falcons listed him officially as a tight end. played some wide receiver at the University of Washington and finished his career at New Mexico. So potentially, if he's a tight end, he seems to be occupying the role as a pass catching tight end behind Kyle Pitts, which is, we know the Falcons didn't have really anybody. Everybody else on the roster, with the exception of Hayden Hurst, was a blocking tight end first that they carried on the roster this year. So potentially Linnaeus could be in the mix there to, show out as a pass catcher. His claim to fame is he's the grandson of Eldridge Dickey, who I've learned in doing some research on Linnaeus, was apparently a star college football player at, I think, Tennessee State in the 60s, and had an opportunity to be one of like the first black quarterbacks in the NFL. And of course, the NFL in the United States did what they do in the 1960s, and moved him away from that position, and made him into a wide receiver, and his career never really took off there. But that's kind of his claim to fame, and we'll see if Linnaeus can sort of get into the mix as a pass catcher. They also worked out another CFL wide receiver, the guy that actually led the CFL in receiving yards this past year, Kenny Lawler, who was a draft pick of the Seahawks, I think in 2016, kind of bounced around on their practice squad for a couple of years before going north of the border. He's also a bigger wide receiver. I think he's listed at like 6'2", 200 pounds or so. And so we'll see what his future is, his status as well. They also worked out Jamal Davis, a pass rusher who the Falcons did show some interest in out of Akron back in the 2019 pre-draft process. And he bounced around the NFL for a couple of years before going to Montreal this past year and had 4 sacks with the Alouettes in the CFL. So we'll see if the Falcons wind up signing more of those guys at a later date. But it's notable, obviously, outside of Davis, that the Falcons are looking at receivers and cornerbacks, and maybe that means something in terms of what their potential overarching offseason plans are. Or maybe that just means that, given that the CFL is much more of a passing league than the NFL is, that those are the two positions that primarily you would look at in terms of that being a farm system for NFL talent. So that's something may have to revisit in 2 months. As I'm sitting here thinking, like, does the fact that the Falcons are looking at CFL players mean that they're not going to be as proactive in NFL free agency in 2 months from now, as I think a lot of people are hoping them to be? So we'll just sort of have to see about that. But that could be a potential signal. But again, we won't know the answer to that until we get to March. And so this is a topic that's, just sort of planting a seed, and we will revisit this 2 months from now and say, well, the Falcons went after CFL guys was relevant to their sort of more quieter free agency. Or we'll sit here and say, no, they just were just looking for opportunities to find some, farm some talent on the relative cheap that has gotten some development. And we've seen with a guy like Eric Harris, who got his start in the CFL before making his way to the NFL, initially with New Orleans when Terry Fontenot was a pro scouting director. And this seems to be sort of Terry Fontenot's wheelhouse as a former pro scouting director. This is where sort of his bread is buttered more so than in the draft, this sort of type of free agency. So this may be just Terry Fontenot flexing his wings, or whatever the case, flexing his arms in terms of seeing if he can sort of mine that CFL for future talent for the Falcons, similar to what the Saints tried to do with Eric Harris, and he eventually caught on with the Raiders before coming to Atlanta this past year. So we'll just sort of have to see how that goes, and we'll see how the rest of today's episode of Locked On Falcons, when we get into the Q&A portion, starting off with sort of readdressing Calvin Ridley status, talking about Russell Gage's potential return in Atlanta, and more topics as draft related topics as we get further into today's episode. But before we get there, guys, I know you're looking for that edge, just like the Falcons are looking for that edge to find talent north of the border, but you're looking for the edge in other ways. And onlinegambling.com is a website dedicated to giving gamblers that edge, inspiring you to beat the odds throughout the playoffs. They're providing you with the best NFL tips, news, and more to help make your bets as informed as ever. Just go to onlinegambling.com/NFL and check out the latest NFL playoff news and tips on how you can get that edge. Don't make emotional decisions with your hard-earned dollars. Make informed ones with the information sourced by various experts by visiting the website before you even place your bets to double check with that. So make sure you visit onlinegambling.com/NFL for all the latest gambling news and tips to give you the edge throughout the playoffs. Remember, onlinegambling.com/NFL to make the most of this year's playoffs. So our first question comes from One Flew Over to Falcons Nest at Mave2124. He asks, how does Calvin Ridley not playing affect the salary cap in his contract for next year? I heard his deal can be told, basically paying him this year's salary again next year and pay the 5th-year option in 23. So I have discussed this already on the podcast, but let's go over it again because obviously there's some confusion. No, his contract is not told. Now, I got it wrong before when I said he played in 5 games. He needs to play come back and play another 6 game in order for him to get credit for the season. That's not the case. He did play in 5 games, but he was also on the inactive list for 2 other games. So he did get credit towards free agency. And for those of you that don't know the rules, if you are on a team's roster for 6 games, and they call it the active roster, but it includes not only the 53-man active roster, but also those, 5 or so players that are inactive each day on game day. It includes the injured reserve. It includes the physically unable to perform list, the pup list, and other various reserve lists. You do get credit towards free agency if you're on that list. And because Calvin Ridley was inactive for those 2 additional games, he did get credit towards free agency. So he will not have his contract told. He will get his 2022 fifth-year option from the Falcons, which is going to be worth about $11.1 million, fully guaranteed. And the way that the fifth-year options work under the new CBA that was signed last year, those are fully guaranteed at the time where they're paid out, or at least set. So teams won't be able to get out of them like we could have gotten out of the Vic Beasley fifth-year option 2 years ago. So, basically the only way that you can get out of that contract is by trading the contract, which is going to be potentially an option for the Falcons. So Calvin Ridley is set to count $11.1 million against the Falcons salary cap this year. And the only way that they can lower or lighten that number is by trading him or signing him to a contract extension, and thus lowering the number with a much more money paid out in the future. So James Long at James Long GSU asks, since obviously there is a strong likelihood that the Atlanta wide receiver room will look very different next year, regardless of what happens with Ridley, how aggressively or passively do you expect the Falcons front office to want to re-sign Russell Gage, given his comments about wanting to be here and his seeming decent improvement in the back half of the season that would make him a competent wide receiver 2? Is it entirely dependent on having Ridley at wide receiver 1, or the ability to find a free agent wide receiver 1 to sit above Gage on the depth chart? So, James, you asked a question a couple of weeks ago when we had Alan Stirk on the podcast, and I said, what GSU is that? Is that Georgia State or Georgia Southern? And of course, I finally looked at your Twitter profile, and it's Georgia State. So for anybody out there that was wondering, and I made the joke that probably pissed off half the state of Georgia, saying which one's the real GSU. I'm sure Younghoe Koo has a different opinion than what James has, but as for Russell Gage's status, I do think it's probably tied pretty closely to Calvin Ridley. I feel like if Ridley is traded this offseason, if that is the plan moving forward, then the Falcons will make it a bigger priority to bring Russell Gage back before he hits free agency. As you mentioned, we know that Russell Gage did step up his game in the second half of the season. And for those of you guys that are looking for reasons to, praise Arthur Smith, I think Russell Gage is one of the handful of scenarios where you can sit there and say, yeah, Arthur Smith does deserve praise for being able to incorporate him more into his offense. And that's something that we can talk about at a future date when we get into sort of year-end reviews and look back at the season. But right now, Calvin Ridley and Frank Darby, along with Chad Hansen and Austin Trammell, 2 of those future contracts, practice squad players that the Falcons did re-sign, are the only wide receivers currently on the team that are under contract. Again, maybe they bring in another CFL guy. Olamide Zaccheaus and Christian Blake are both impending restricted free agents, which means that the Falcons could bring them back if they tender them. Again, we can sort of get into that at a later date, whether or not what the Falcons can do. But as for Gage, I do think it's going to depend very much on what Ridley's status is going to be, as well as what Russell Gage's price point is going to be. You compare Russell Gage as a potential wide receiver 2 to someone like a Mohamed Sanu, and look at Gage's production here in Atlanta the last couple of years compared to Sanu's production those last years in Cincinnati before he hit free agency, as well as Sanu's production in those first 3 years in Atlanta. And you can come out of it saying Russell Gage has been more productive. And so, as many people told me back in the day, where Sanu was well worth the $6.5 million a year that we paid him then, if that is the case and Russell Gage is arguably a better or equal receiver, then that would mean if you adjust 2016 salary cap dollars when the cap was $155 million to what the cap is going to be in 2022, which is about $108 million, which again, if you're sort of adjusting with salary cap inflation, $1 in 2016 is now worth $1.34 in 2022. That would mean that $6.5 million would be worth about $8.7 million now. So seemingly Russell Gage and his representatives should be able to ask for $8.5 to $9 million a year on a new contract to be the quote unquote wide receiver 2 here in Atlanta. And, if the Falcons can get him at a cheaper deal than that, then I think the Falcons will be all over. If they can get him at like $6 or $7 million a year, they will definitely try to bring back Russell Gage, because you can make the case that he's a big bargain at that point in time. But if it's now 9, 10 or more $1 million, which again, I don't think it's crazy to think that he could get that on the open market, then I don't necessarily expect the Falcons to, bend over backwards to pay that type of money, given that there are plenty of other 26 and 27-year-old slot receivers like Russell Gage that are potentially going to be cheaper out there on the market that the Falcons could bring in. Maybe some of those guys aren't as good, but certainly options for the Falcons. In terms of spending on a wide receiver 1 this offseason, I'm not necessarily expecting it, but again, a lot can change in the next 2 months. That could change, that narrative or whatever case may be. But I would generally expect your expectations to be low, and the Falcons will probably, if they do wind up moving on from Calvin Ridley, will probably try to bring back Russell Gage and then draft a wide receiver 1, probably somewhere on day 2 or 3 of the draft, and hope that they can hit on that guy. That's my kind of expectation at this point in time. But again, we have a lot, to learn over the next 2 to 3 months. So, again, going back to the CFL wide receivers, maybe the fact that the Falcons are showing interest in that is already kind of tell you that they're moving in the direction of moving on from not only Calvin Ridley, but also Russell Gage. So time will tell on that issue. Moving to our next question from Dirty Bird Digest on Twitter. He asks, how would you feel if the Falcons targeted a player like Linderbaum in the draft, a guy who played center at Iowa? He's the best interior offensive lineman available, but we also drafted 2 centers in 2 consecutive drafts. Thoughts? So I am not a fan of taking Tyler Linderbaum. It's not because I don't think he's a very good player. I think he's a very good center prospect, and certainly one of the better center prospects that we've seen in recent memory. I do not expect him to be drafted as high as some current mock drafts are projecting him as a potential top 10, top 12 pick. I think he might go maybe in the latter part of the round, maybe after pick 15 or so. Like if there was a team that was going to use a reasonably high pick, a top 20 pick on him, would probably be Philadelphia, because of the similarities that he has with Jason Kelce. But when you look at the history of the NFL draft, there haven't been that many sub 300-pound centers taken in round 1. The one exception was Garrett Bradbury, was taken a couple of years ago by the Vikings, and Bradbury has not lived up to that status from that 2019 draft class. And because we know the NFL is a copycat league, and the NFL does value players a lot when it comes to drafting based off of their measurables. You got to be a certain height, a certain length, a certain size, all this various things. I think the odds are against Linderbaum being drafted as high as certain current mocks are projecting him. So I don't necessarily expect him to really be in the mix for the Falcons at pick number 8, as maybe some mocks are projecting him to be. But I wouldn't necessarily be a big fan of it. Again, not because I don't think Linderbaum is a great prospect, but the Falcons drafting another sort of 290-pound undersized center that struggles against size, even if he's more athletic and probably a much better player than Matt Hennessy, just does not necessarily fill me with excitement. I think Linderbaum will probably do better against the Vita Veas and Derek Browns of the world than our current options. I think he would be an upgrade over Matt Hennessy, but because the Falcons have already invested 2 picks in undersized centers, investing a third in that group just doesn't fill me with a lot of joy. So if the Falcons are going to address their center position, I would much rather see them go with a veteran in free agency, like a Ben Jones, who we know has had success in Arthur Smith's offense, or James Daniels, who has the versatility to play all 3 interior line positions and could potentially be an upgrade at least 2 of those spots. We know Chris Lindstrom we don't have to worry about the right guard position, but certainly left guard or center, 2 positions that James Daniel has played at a reasonably high level in Chicago, would certainly be upgrades there. So I would much rather see the Falcons splurge in free agency on a veteran center than necessarily going with another young, inexperienced center, even though I do think Linderbaum is considerably better than Matt Hennessy. And I certainly would think, for another team, like, again, Philadelphia was looking to replace Jason Kelce, had a lot of success with a sub 200 or 290-pound center, makes perfect sense for them to draft him, or team pickings in the later part of the first round in the 20s somewhere. Absolutely would think that would be a home run pick for them with Linderbaum. But for the Falcons, It doesn't move me in a major way. That is considerably one of the least sexiest picks for the Falcons. And yes, I do care about sex appeal when it comes to the draft. Yes, I want sex appeal with the draft because, again, we don't know if these players are going to be good until 3 years from now. And so, like, if you want to get me excited about a draft pick, then it's got to get me sex appeal at least early on. You want to get me excited before we jump into bed. You like, put on some sexy lingerie with these draft picks. And if that makes you feel uncomfortable, that was the whole point. Moving on to the next question, where you guys turn off the podcast. Let's talk about Christian Farholt's question at C Farholt on Twitter. He asked, projected any compensatory picks in 2022. For my research, it is dependent on Justin McCray playing enough snaps this season. Well, I don't know about the Justin McCray thing. I just go to overthecap.com and look at their projections. They generally are like 90% accurate, if not more, when their projections, and they have the Falcons projected to get a 6th-round compensatory pick this year for Alex Mack. So that's where I'm going with, and they were pretty accurate the last couple of years with projecting where the Falcons will be picking. So I'm willing to go with that. Joey Bear, the X is silent on at Joe Bear 74 on Twitter, asks, they say it takes 3 years to fairly evaluate a draft class. What are your feelings on the 2019 draft class, and where do you rank it in the last decade? Personally, I think it's bottom 3 with 12 and 17. So he's obviously talking about the Falcons 2019 draft class. I'm pretty neutral to that draft class. I think it's basically an average draft class. You got one Pro Bowl caliber starter in Chris Lindstrom. You got one mid-level starter in Caleb McGarry. You got 3 role players in Kaminsky, Sheffield, and Olesen. And then you got 2 guys that are basically out of the league in Marcus Green and Jordan Miller, although Miller's still kicking around with the Saints, and Green, I think, is in the CFL. So they're not completely out of football or anything like that. So that, to me, is about an average draft class that you would expect out of any 7-player draft class, particularly when you only have 2, early round picks in on days 1 and 2. So that's about it. So it's pretty typical to me. I know really it boils down to where you feel about this draft class. It really boils down to Caleb McGarry, right? And if he winds up being a 1 contract player, which he seems to be on track to be, that makes that draft class look a little bit worse, because as a 1st round pick, typically you want those guys to be 2 contract guys, right? And if they're only a 1 contract guy, then that's, you're going to feel a little bit underwhelmed with those guys. But I point out, when it comes to Caleb McGarry, when you evaluate him, particularly in context to the rest of the tackles taken in that draft class, he does rise a little bit more to the top. Obviously, Jonah Williams is the top guy from that draft class, but after that, you can make a pretty strong argument that Caleb McGarry is 2 or 3 in that draft class, that you can look at the Falcons trading up to get him, and the fact that he's outperformed the guys that they would have settled for in round 2, like Cody Ford, Greg Little, Titus Howard, Dalton Reisner, Jawan Taylor, etc., means that, Caleb McGarry is probably not as bad. Again, this continues to be the argument I say on the podcast. Hey, he's not as bad as people make him out to be. Like, he's not good, but he's not as bad as people make him out to be. So I feel like when we look at, that draft class, we do have to put that into some context that adds context to it. And, when you look at PFF data, they basically say years 3 and 4 are the sort of years where offensive linemen make the biggest leaps in the NFL. So, for those guys, all of those guys, while we look at them and say, they haven't necessarily lived up to expectations based off of their early round expectations, they got one more year 4, for them to make that leap. And if they do, that will sort of solidify their status in the NFL, or they might wind up going by the wayside. So we'll just sort of have to see it. So Caleb McGarry's got one more chance to really prove himself. So if you do put it in the bottom 3, I'm not going to argue with you. I don't necessarily spend a lot of energy ranking draft class. You guys know me. I'm not a big fan of ranking a lot of things. I just think it's kind of a waste of time. So if you want to put them in the bottom 3, you're not going to get a big argument from me in that regard. But if it is one of the bottom 3 drafts, and it's basically an average or slightly below average draft class by NFL standards, that kind of tells you that the other 7 classes of the last decade are at least average to above average, which at least tells you that, maybe Thomas Dimitroff is not nearly as bad at drafting as a lot of people would lead you to believe, if you have heard, the various tweets and takes on various platforms over the last year and a half in regard to his drafting status. So I would say, like, if it's bottom 3 and it's a pretty average draft class, that probably means like 70% of the time the Falcons had an above average draft class, which I think is actually true. So that if that's the case, that's where we'll leave it at that. But that's where we'll leave it, and we'll get into our final question of the day, talking about some numbers that suggest that basically, if you're going to make a Super Bowl, you got to make the playoffs or go to the title game within the first 2 years, and what does that mean for Arthur Smith's future in Atlanta? We'll get into that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But before we do, again, I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And I always have recommendations for what your second listen should be. And of course, local shows like Locked On Braves, Locked On Hawks, and of course, Locked On Bulldogs, where Clint and Daniel have you guys covered for all the post-national championship reactions and give you the lowdown. They certainly will be celebrating on that podcast for the coming weeks and or months, if not years. So if you're interested in celebrating that, by all means, subscribe to the Locked On Bulldogs channel, which is free and available on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. So as the Falcons are looking to save money in free agency, you can save money too, but on gas. Every time you fill up, when you're in that bumper to bumper Atlanta traffic, you wind up spending a lot of money on gas, and you can save money with a new app called Get Upside. There's no catch. All you got to do is download the app on the App Store or on Google Play. It's a free app. You just head over, you open it, you find the nearest gas station to you. There's thousands of locations that you can save money that are eligible for Get Upside, and you can save up to 25 cents back per gallon every time you fill up. Again, no catch there. And then when you sign up with Get Upside and use our promo code Touchdown, you get a bonus 25 cents back on your first fill up. So that's up to 50 cents back per gallon. And with that type of money, you can save up to $300 a month with those savings that you can put towards a lot of things. You can get them paid out in your bank account, PayPal. I like to get them on my Amazon gift card. So don't pay full price at the pump anymore. Download the free Get Upside app and use the promo code Touchdown when you sign up. That's Get Upside, promo code Touchdown, to start saving every time you fill up. So why not take all the money that you save with Get Upside and use it to bet on your favorite sports? Whether we're talking about playoff football, basketball, hockey, boxing, UFC, all the way to your favorite Vegas casino games, BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports. And I'm going to give you the bets that I'm going to make. I'm going to put a 3-team parlay in this weekend for the NFL playoff action. I'm going to take the Bills -4 over the Pats, the Bucks as 9-point favorites over the Eagles, and the Rams as 4-point favorites over the Cardinals. Whether you agree with those picks or not and want to make your own, just head over to betonline.ag, use that updated desktop or mobile website, and use the promo code Locked On to get a 50% welcome bonus. That means if you deposit $200, you get $100 in free money to play with, whether you put it on the Rams, the Cardinals, the Eagles, or whoever. Don't wait. Take advantage of all the amazing offers available at BetOnline, where the game starts. So our last question comes from Ryan Helton at That Crazy YM on Twitter. He asks, would love to hear your thoughts on this conclusion in a podcast sometime. And so he was basically referring me to another tweet that someone replied to something that Adam Schefter said about, coaches getting fired or whatever the case may be. And this comes from Jason Eric Hill 13 on Twitter. He basically put a screen cap of a spreadsheet that he put up, and he basically said the math in history is clear. If you don't make the playoffs within your first 2 years as a coach, you'll never win in the NFL. People are starting to get it. It's rightfully a win now league, period. And so basically he posted a spreadsheet that had 25 years of data from 1993 to 2008 that showed all the teams and their coaches that made it to the AFC and NFC championship games, basically, 100 data points, and 93 of those teams were coached by a coach that either reached the title game within the first 2 years of his time with that team or made the playoffs within the first 2 years. And 58 times they made the title game within the first 2 years, and 35 times they made the playoffs within the 2 years, and thus would go on to make the title game further down the line. So, of course, several Falcons coaches, including Dan Reeves, Mike Smith, Jim Moore, and Dan Quinn, appeared on this list. Obviously, Reeves, Moore, and Quinn all made the title game within the first 2 years. And in fact, they made the title games the first time that those teams went to the playoffs. And of course, Mike Smith didn't make the title game until year 5, but made the playoffs in year 1, coming out of the gate. So my thoughts on this is I am surprised that the number is so high, basically 93% of the time based off of this data. That coaches, that eventually go on and put their teams in a position to go to a Super Bowl, uh, either made the playoffs within 2 years or made the title game within 2 years. Although noted, there are a lot of repeat coaches on this list, particularly in the AFC with Belichick and Tomlin and Harbaugh and all those guys, and Holmgren in the early '90s and whatnot in the NFC and whatnot. So you look at the list, instead of 100 coaches, it's 52 coaches, but still 46 out of those 52 or 45 out of those 52 coaches had that sort of within 2 year success, whether it's playoffs or title games. So that's still like 88%. So roughly 90% of the time, coaches that wind up, putting their teams in a position to go to the Super Bowl based off of this data had some success within the first 2 years, whether we're measuring that by going to the conference championship game or whether we're measuring that by making the playoffs. So again, I think that number is surprisingly high. I would expect it to be a high number, but would not expect it to be basically 90% of the time. I would think it would be maybe like 60 to 75% of the time or something like that. And I think that's why, going back to this season with the Falcons and Arthur Smith, when, those first couple of weeks when we were, or at least when I was complaining about the slow start that the Falcons had this season, and a lot of people were preaching patience and like, oh, you got to be patient, and he's still a first year coach. And that's why I was kind of like, well, like we've seen plenty of coaches come out of the gates and have success. Right. We've seen so many coaches in Atlanta come out of the gates and have success. And so this idea of patience is kind of, for me at least, fell on deaf ears. Right? Like I'm impatient at this point in time. I want the Falcons to be good at this point in time, and I don't necessarily have the patience to wait 3 or 4 years for the Falcons to be good. Or certainly, I can't control whether or not the Falcons are good for the next 3 or 4 years, but certainly over the next 3 or 4 years, you're not going to hear me sitting here and like, it's all fine. Basically, I'm going to complain about the whole time. But, I think when you look at the Falcons, obviously named several coaches that had immediate success here in Atlanta, and going into the season, you heard me talk about this. Like, I thought the biggest question mark was not whether or not Arthur Smith would find immediate success here. It was going to be, unlike his predecessors, whether he would be able to sustain it beyond 2 or 3 years, which has been the majority case for a lot of the Falcons, for the Dan Reeves, the Mike Smiths, the Dan Quinns, the Jim Moores, etc. Obviously, Mike Smith was able to sustain it for 5 years, but then couldn't do so after that point in time. And so obviously, that was my big question mark for Arthur Smith. It's like, oh, he'll wind up having success right out of the gates, because again, contrary to popular opinion, I don't think 7 wins is as impressive a win total. To me, I thought 7 wins was the bare minimum that any competent coach could have achieved given the Falcons schedule this year. I won't go into that on today's episode, but I feel like when you look at this data, the lazy interpretation is probably the interpretation that, at least based off of his tweet, Jason Eric Hill was doing, which is basically, if you don't have success within 2 years, you'll never have it. I don't know if that's really fair, but I do think what this data is telling you, that the NFL does stand for not for long. And if you don't have early success early on, you'll probably not have too many other opportunities down the road to achieve success later on. It's not to say that it's impossible for you to do it, but it is one of those things that the pressure to win in the NFL is high. And so basically, if you don't achieve it, like, what is the average coaching tenure, right? Again, I did a quick Google search before jumping on the podcast, and some of the data basically said about 4 years. And that was from a couple of years ago. So I don't know what it is now. And then I saw another article that said it's about 64 games, but that article in their data basically excluded all the coaches that only lasted 1 year, which would probably bring down that total. So 64 games is basically 4 seasons, or 4 16-game seasons. So that number is actually probably lower than that. So less than 4 years, if you start including the Freddie Kitchens and the Steve Wilkses and the Urban Meyers into the list. And then you look at the 7 open jobs right now, including the Raiders, of the fired coaches. Those guys only averaged about 3.7 years in their respective jobs before they eventually got fired during this cycle. So again, it seems to be about like let's say 3.7 years seems to be an appropriate number for that. And so, like, that's how quick it is. The turnaround is expected to be. And it's very similar to the expectations with the player, right? Your early season success or your early career success is going to dictate how many future opportunities you're going to get in this league. You look at a player like Jalen Mayfield, right? His draft status is certainly going to afford him one opportunity to be the starter. Maybe he gets a second opportunity this upcoming season in 2022. But if Jalen Mayfield doesn't show significant growth in 2022 and look like a competent starter, do you think he's going to get another opportunity to start in 2023? I don't think he is. I'm pretty sure all of you would agree with that he basically has two strikes before he strikes out. And I think it's a similar situation with coaches. That's basically what that's how I'm interpreting this data. If you don't find success at the end of year two, it doesn't mean that you're going to get fired in year three. And that's the case with Arthur Smith. If the Falcons don't make the playoffs in year two going into this season, does it mean that Arthur Smith is going to be on a hotter seat in year three? Absolutely. But it doesn't mean that the Falcons are going to fire him. No, I don't think so. But it does mean that, he's not going to have too long a leash moving forward. You look at Dan Quinn basically being the first coach that Arthur Blank, hadn't fired after missing the playoffs 2 years in a row. And obviously that did not pay off for the Falcons in 2020. And they ultimately fired Dan Quinn. So I expect when that situation comes around again and a coach misses the playoffs 2 years in a row, you're not going to see Arthur Smith practice patience. So again, I'm not saying that Arthur Blank will practice patience. Too many Arthurs. Arthur Smith won't get fired if the Falcons miss the playoffs this upcoming year, but the seat's going to be hot in year three, and he's going to have to make the playoffs in year three. And so therefore what happens is, okay, if he does wind up making the playoffs in year three, then guess what? Like, he can't go back to being a non-playoff team. The Falcons are gonna have to make the playoff in perpetuity, because the minute they take a step back, right? The minute, like, if they in 2024 and they miss the playoffs, then guess what? Arthur Smith's getting fired. And we're gonna have a new coach in 2025. Right. And he'll last 4 years. Right. And if they make the playoffs in 2023 and 2024, and then they miss the playoffs in 2025. Okay, maybe that buys him 2026. But if he misses the playoffs a second time, then boom, he's gone. And we're gonna have a new coach in 2027. So this is basically what this data is kind of telling you, is that you don't have a long leash, and your early success lengthens your leash. Look at Matt Nagy, right? That's basically what happened. He came out of the gates. They went 12-4 in his first year in Chicago, and he got 3 more years. But 8-8, 8-8, and then 6-11 this past year, and they're like, enough is enough, right? That early success bought you that 4th year, right? That's basically what it was. But like after that, it's like, nope, 3 years of missing the postseason, like, you're gone, my guy. So that's kind of what this data to me is telling you. Like, I wouldn't sit here and say, oh, if you don't have success early on, you'll never have success. I will sit here and say, if you don't have success early on, you're not going to get any opportunities. It's basically, you strike out twice, you get 2 at bats, right? That's basically what it's telling you. You get 2 at bats, and if you strike out a third time, boom, you're gone, right? You'll get one more chance, and you better hit a home run. That's kind of what it's basically saying. And, you're looking at this situation with the Falcons. There's going to be pressure on Arthur Smith to win sooner versus later. And I think that pressure applies not to 2023, but to 2022. And if the Falcons show regression in 2022 and are looking like they're going backwards, again, I don't think Arthur Smith is going to get fired, but I certainly think he's going to be on a hot seat in 2023. Now, if the Falcons show significant growth in 2022, then that's going to buy Arthur Smith a lot more, positive will or whatever, goodwill moving forward. And so therefore, 2023 and 2024, if they continue to show that growth, then we will see that. So this year, I think, is going to be a critical year to determine whether Arthur Smith is here for the long term or not. And again, I'm not saying that the Falcons have to make the playoffs in order for Arthur Smith to find success, but it certainly will make his job and that leash much longer for him if they do make the playoffs, and at the very least show improvement against a much harder schedule. For this team to win 8 or 9 games next year, that's huge, right? But winning 7 games against the 4th easiest schedule in the league, that's not as impressive as I think a lot of people are trying to make it out to be. So those are my thoughts on that, Ryan. And those are my thoughts on all those questions on today. And of course, you guys are more than welcome to send in future questions to be answered on future Q&As by hitting me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. Tomorrow's episode, we are wrapping up the week with a guest, none other than Charles McDonald, our old friend who covers the NFL for the Win, USA Today website, and we'll get his thoughts on this upcoming season, as well as maybe some of the Falcons' potential priorities in free agency, and see where his head is at on this current state of the Atlanta Falcons. So that will be what's in store for you guys on tomorrow's episode when you make Locked On Falcons your first listen. And as always, always have recommendations for your second listen. Why not make it the Locked On Bets podcast, where handicapping expert Lee Sterling is giving you his daily picks, his blowout specials, and his lock of the day to help you make a little bit more money when you go to bet online, when you go to onlinegambling.com and all that sort of stuff. So subscribe to the Locked On Bets podcast on all the available podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. So, guys, that's going to do it for us here on Locked On Falcons. Appreciate it. Till then.